we can move past prohibition, and now we're in the middle of the 20th century. Police officers are now heavily motorized, and cars are central to that. How did that proliferation continue even after prohibition ended up ending?
Sure. So one of the big developments in the middle of the 20th century that I talk about is suburbanization. So with the sort of daily commuting that automobiles enabled for millions of Americans, we get this massive push to suburbanize, and that comes with the construction of highways that decimate urban neighborhoods, really creates the massive residential racial segregation that comes to characterize the United States, as well as further concentrating urban poverty, and sort of creating these environments that we now associate with some of the most egregious overreaches and abuses in contemporary policing. And then as vehicle patrol becomes the predominant technology of American policing through the middle part of the 20th century, that's when we replace the cop on the beat, if you will, the officer who's walking around a neighborhood directly interacting with residents and so forth, with the cruiser and with the officer that is cruising through the neighborhood, passing through the neighborhood, not building those same types of connections with members of the community. And lots of people, I'm certainly not the only one, lots of people have mentioned or analyzed how this has affected police community relations and helped contribute to the real deterioration of trust between police and their communities.
How did the development of interstate highways during this period also affect policing in this way? Did it federalize a lot of this stuff?
Sure. So automobiles in general, from the the early parts of the 20th century when they began to proliferate, created real sort of jurisdictional issues, because now it was much easier, especially in the more densely populated Northeast, where the states were smaller and state boundaries were closer. It was much easier to move between states, right? To commit a crime in one state and abscond to another, or something along those lines. So this, from the early part of the 20th century, really helped propel what people call the federalization of criminal justice and an expanding role for the federal government. So you get the FBI in the early part of the 20th century, before it was even called the FBI, back when it was called the Bureau of Investigation, enforcing laws like the Dyer Act, which criminalize the interstate transport of stolen vehicles. And that becomes the jurisdictional hook that allows the FBI to get involved in manhunts for John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and these really kind of high-profile outlaws of the era. And as you move forward into the middle part of the 20th century, into the later part of the 20th century, interstate highways sort of supercharge that phenomenon, where especially certain types of crime, the transport of illegal drugs, the illegal transport of human beings, right? These are crimes that are definitionally interjurisdictional in almost every case, creating real issues if a state-level law enforcement agency wants to investigate and potentially help prosecute these types of offenses. And so the federal government really steps in and takes a much more prominent role in criminal justice, and particularly in addressing these types of offenses that are now almost by definition interstate in nature.
And then we get really to the 1970s, and the car is basically essential for people to get from point A to point B. We're building entire communities based on the car. Very little public transportation in terms of the way that many governments are prioritizing new development there. And we're also now seeing the drug war ramp up. What did the 1970s bring to this shift in policing?
Well, the acceleration of the drug war, I think, in the 70s is really a very crucial development. And, we're at this point, and especially once you get into the latter part of the 1970s and into the 1980s, that's when you're really seeing the rise of mass incarceration, right, which is itself largely a product of the war on drugs and associated enforcement efforts. And this is also the period in the 70s when the federalization of law enforcement really kicks in a major way, in large part as a consequence of the federal government's role in the war on drugs, and this being a federally orchestrated enforcement measure. So beginning in the 70s and into the 80s and the 90s is when we get a lot of these federal omnibus crime bills and so forth that lead to federal criminal law largely duplicating state criminal laws, meaning that any given offense can, in almost every case, potentially be prosecuted either by federal authorities or state authorities. So that's another big development from that period.
Yeah. And then federalizing also the systems that come with that, which are racial profiling, because once these Fourth Amendment standards are dropped, it gives much more officer discretion. And what does officer discretion mean? It means that racist tropes can be replicated and also grafted onto one's supposedly, natural intuition. If you could just talk a bit about that as a replication of some of the racist politics in this country.
Sure. So I think sort of a key precedential point here is Terry versus Ohio, the 1968 Supreme Court decision, which authorized what we might call the pretextual stop or the investigatory stop. So the ability to temporarily detain someone based on quote unquote reasonable suspicion. And that precedent and then subsequent activity deriving therefrom really creates the opportunity for biases, especially along the lines of race and ethnicity, but along other lines as well, to factor heavily into what policing looks like in this country. And by empowering officers to make determinations about who is reasonably suspicious and who isn't, you are creating an environment that is conducive to people acting on the basis of biases, even if those biases, as I think they are in many cases, are unconscious or implicit or unstated. Even if officers, stopping someone to question them and perform kind of mini investigations either on the sidewalk or on the side of the road, even if they're not in any way explicitly or consciously motivated by racial bias, the fact is that there are strong stereotypes around race and criminality and dangerousness that are widespread across the American populace. And those biases, we know from a lot of empirical evidence about vehicle stops as well as pedestrian stops, those biases do tend to have an effect. They do tend to shape who officers see as suspicious, who they see as potentially involved in crime, and therefore who is more likely to experience one of these stops, whether it be a pedestrian stop or a vehicle stop.
I mean, and then we're kind of in the modern era now where we can see how traffic stops lead to disproportionate police violence against Black people. Sandra Bland is an infamous example of somebody who was killed in a jail cell or died in a jail cell after she was arrested because she didn't properly signal when she was changing lanes. And then, there are many more examples of this kind of police brutality. If you don't, if you could just bring that into the conversation.
Sure. So in 1996 is when we get Wren, like the bird, but with an H, Wren versus United States, which explicitly extends the basic Terry precedent to the vehicular context, and explicitly in a unanimous decision written by the late Justice Scalia, explicitly says that officers are free to stop vehicles and temporarily detain people for any traffic violation of any kind, even if the purpose of the stop is not to enforce traffic law, even if the purpose of the stop is to conduct a miniature roadside investigation. So with that really formal blessing of this type of activity, yeah, we see an even greater prevalence of what Charles F. and his colleagues in their book Pulled Over called the investigatory stop. And one of the points that they make very forcefully in that book, which I think is crucial for people to recognize, is that there is a real difference between a stop that is initiated for the purposes of traffic safety and a stop that is initiated for the purposes of one of these little mini roadside investigations, a pretextual stop that is only pretextually motivated by traffic safety. There are no, according to Epp and his colleagues' research and other people who've studied this systematically, there are no significant racial disparities in the rates at which people stop, at which police stop people for traffic safety violations. Those stops appear to be overwhelmingly triggered by people breaking traffic laws, right? Excessive speeding, running red lights, etc. Where all of the overall disparity in rates of vehicle stops by race comes from is the disparity in rates at which people are stopped for these investigatory purposes. So the quote unquote DWB, driving while black phenomenon, is largely explained, if not entirely explained, by differences in who police tend to see as suspicious, and differences in who police target for these investigatory vehicle stops. And as you suggest, right, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, the list goes on and on of people, disproportionately black people and other people of color, who have experienced not only harassment, stops, arrests, criminal charges, but violence and death as a result of these policies.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's the added element of the seizure of people's cars as kind of publicly available property that can be taken in order to get people to pay back certain debts and things like that. That's completely been normalized by our society.
Yeah, so one of the chapters in the book, I attend to this phenomenon of civil asset forfeiture, which maybe you've talked about on your show before. It's gotten some attention, I think, especially recently. But these are laws at the state and federal level that authorize the government to seize and keep people's property based on probable cause, according to their assessment, to believe that that property was somehow involved in criminal activity, even if the person never faces criminal charges, even if they're never prosecuted or convicted of anything. The government can nevertheless seize property, and they do by the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. I connect this to cars in the book because the most common way that one of these civil asset forfeiture actions begins is with a vehicle stop, and a vehicle stop where police find cash or they find something else that leads them to believe that there might be some connection to criminal activity. That can authorize them to seize cash, seize the vehicle, seize other property, and keep it.
Well, this is a fascinating way to look at our history of criminal justice, and an important one. The book is called Rules of the Road, The Automobile and the Transformation of American Criminal Justice. We will put a link to the book wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority at .fm. Spencer, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emma. It's a pleasure.